Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're doing a deep dive, looking closely at some source material about a recent policy idea. We're talking about creating specific accounts for newborns.
Right, and the specific source we're digging into today is an excerpt from a YouTube transcript. It's from the Rebel Capitalist channel.
Got it. So our mission here is really to pull apart the details of this policy, as it's laid out in that source, and then importantly, explore this pretty surprising argument the source makes.
Yeah, the argument that this, well, seemingly simple policy could actually be setting up the infrastructure for a central bank digital currency, a CBDC.
Exactly. So we'll look at what the policy is, how the source described, like the mechanics behind it, where the money actually lives, and why this source thinks it connects to these, well, bigger concerns, things like government control, the future of currency. We want to help you, listening, get a really clear sense of the perspective presented in this material.
Makes sense.
So let's start right there, with the policy itself. As the source describes it, they call them Trump accounts for newborns. What are the basic nuts and bolts they lay out?
Okay, so according to this source, the main idea is a grant, essentially. $1,000 given for every child born after January 1st, 2025.
Okay, $1,000 bucks.
Yeah. And then parents have an option. They can contribute more money themselves, up to $5,000 per year, into that same account.
And the name. The source mentioned it wasn't always called Trump accounts.
That's right. They note that earlier discussions apparently used the name MAGA accounts, but it later shifted to Trump accounts, just the detail they included.
Okay, a naming evolution mentioned. Now, there's a detail about how these accounts get set up that the source really flagged as important. What's that?
This is pretty central to their argument later on. So
All right.
while parents can go pick a regular commercial bank initially for this account, the proposal, as described, has this backup plan. If the parents just don't do anything, maybe they forget or don't get around to it, the government will automatically create an account for the child.
Automatically.
Automatically. And then they'd notify the parents afterwards.
Huh. So the default is government action if parents are passive. That's definitely noteworthy. And what about how long this program might stick around? Does the source see this as temporary? They brought up Milton Friedman, I think.
They did, and they argue pretty strongly, actually, that this is designed to be permanent. They lean on that Friedman observation, about how nothing's more permanent than a temporary government program.
Right, the old saying.
Their logic is, look, once you start handing out $1,000 perceived free money for every baby who's going to vote to take that away, it becomes politically almost impossible to repeal, in their view.
Yeah.
So effectively permanent.
Okay, makes sense from that perspective. A program built to last. Now, the money itself, the funds in these accounts, how are they invested? What does the source say about that?
According to the transcript, the rule for these specific accounts is quite strict. The money can only be invested in the stock market, specifically a broad index fund, like they mentioned the S&P 500 as an example.
Only stocks via an index. And what's the source's take on why that specific investment strategy? What's their interpretation?
They interpret that as basically creating an automatic bid for the stock market.
An automatic bid?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Think about it, potentially billions flowing into index funds automatically every year from these accounts. The source argues this will just artificially prop up stock prices. It essentially becomes, in their view, the government acting as a big, guaranteed buyer in the market, supporting valuations whether they're justified or not.
Interesting angle. Okay, so we have the basics, the money, the auto setup possibility, the stock market investment. But the real core of this source's argument, the part that really jumps out, is where these accounts are physically, or rather financially, held, especially those automatic ones. Where does the source say that account gets set up?
Right. This is the linchpin. They state that when the government automatically creates the account, it's established at the Treasury.
The U.S. Treasury, okay? And where does the Treasury itself keep its main bank account?
The Treasury's primary operational account, its checking account essentially, is held on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. This is known as the Treasury General Account, the TGA. It's standard practice.
Okay, so follow the chain. Baby's automatic account is at the Treasury. The Treasury's main account is at the Fed. So what's the leap the source makes here? How do they connect that baby's account directly to the Fed?
This is their crucial step. They argue that because the baby's account is held at the Treasury and the Treasury's TGA is at the Fed, That baby's account effectively becomes a sub-account of the TGA.
A sub-account of the TGA.
Exactly. And since the TGA is on the Fed's books, a liability of the Fed, they argue this makes the baby's sub-account also an account at the Fed and, critically, therefore, a liability of the Federal Reserve.
Okay, a liability of the Federal Reserve. Why is that specific phrase so significant for this source? How do they define a CBDC?
Their definition is very direct, and it underpins their whole claim. They basically define a CBDC as a liability of the Federal Reserve, full stop. They frame it as moving towards a world where maybe all the different bank ledgers we have now, at Chase, BOFA, wherever,
Right, commercial banks.
could eventually get merged, conceptually, into one big government-controlled balance sheet held right there at the Fed.
So if their definition of a CBDC is simply a liability of the Fed, and they argue these baby accounts are liabilities of the Fed, then what?
Then their conclusion is, well, unavoidable from their premise. They state unequivocally, based on this mechanism, the sub-account structure making it a Fed liability, that these Trump accounts are the creation of CBDC infrastructure. They literally say they are unequivocally a CBDC liability.
Wow, okay. That's quite a statement, connecting a, seemingly helpful savings plan for kids directly to CBDC infrastructure. The source even draws a historical comparison, don't they?
They do. They bring up the Gosbank system from communist Russia.
Go.
Yeah, the idea being that under Gosbank there was just one central bank, and this gave the government theoretically total visibility and control. They could track all transactions, decide who gets credit, maybe based on political goals, not just economics. The source sees parallels in the potential centralization here.
Okay, let's shift gears just a bit. Funding. How does the source talk about paying for these accounts or maybe future programs using the same plumbing?
Well, they mention the obvious routes, taxes or selling more government debt, like treasuries. But they also touch on less conventional ideas that have been floated out there, like the government literally minting high-value coins.
Like the trillion-dollar coin idea.
Exactly. They reference Paul Krugman's name in connection with that idea, citing it as an example of a mechanism that some argue is technically legal, and importantly, could fund things without officially adding to the deficit or debt numbers. They're highlighting that once the infrastructure's there, novel funding might appear.
Interesting point about the funding possibilities.
Yeah.
What about the legality? Does the source raise any questions about whether the Fed can even hold these kinds of accounts for individuals, even indirectly?
They do raise that concern, yes. They claim the Federal Reserve Act itself actually prohibits the Fed from having accounts for regular people, non-bank retail customers.
Okay.
So their argument is that structuring these as sub-accounts of the Treasury's account is basically a legal workaround, a loophole in their view, to get around that restriction and effectively give individuals accounts tied to the Fed.
Got it. So we've gone through the policy, the mechanics, the CBDC connection according to the source. Now, the really big question, so what? From the source's perspective, what are the potential downsides, the implications, if these kinds of government-linked accounts become common?
Well, they outline several major concerns. The first one that jumps out is privacy.
Privacy, how so?
If your money is sitting in an account that's effectively on the government's or the central bank's books, the source argues the government would know instantly every single thing you buy or receive, real-time surveillance of your finances.
Which is different from now.
Very different in their view. Right now, your details are generally with your commercial bank. The government usually needs a subpoena, some legal process to get that detailed transaction history. This would bypass that, they suggest.
Okay, so loss of financial privacy. What else are they worried about tied to that data and potential government control?
The fears kind of build from there. With that real-time data, they suggest it could open the door to government micromanagement of your spending. Maybe even implementing something like a social credit score, where your spending habits affect your score.
Wow.
And, perhaps most concerning for them, it gives the government a very direct way to control your access to your money. They could potentially restrict certain purchases, or even freeze your account instantly.
Is there an example they use?
Yeah, they point to the situation with the truckers in Canada, where bank accounts were frozen during the protests. They argue that kind of action becomes much easier, much faster, if the government doesn't have to go through commercial banks, but controls the ledger directly.
And the source seems to feel that many people making policy decisions, even those maybe publicly against CBDCs, don't quite get these technical points.
That's a really key part of their message. They explicitly state they believe many politicians, on both sides of the aisle just don't understand these mechanics. They don't grasp the TGA link, the Fed liability aspect. And because they don't understand it, the source argues, they might inadvertently vote for policies like this one, pushing us closer to what the source defines as a government-controlled CBDC system without even realizing it.
Hmm. Looking ahead then, does the source make any specific predictions about where this might lead in the near future?
They make a pretty bold one, actually. They predict a very high likelihood, they even say, within the next 3 years of universal basic income, UBI, being rolled out.
UBI within 3 years.
Yeah.
Why did they think that?
They seem to connect it partly to potential job losses from AI, which might be a broader theme for them. But the key link is the infrastructure.
How do these newborn accounts, in their view, make UBI easier?
They see setting up these automatic treasury accounts for babies as creating the perfect test case and pathway. Once the government has a smooth system for creating and managing direct accounts for individuals, even just babies initially, the source argues it's a really simple step to just scale that up. Set up similar treasury-linked accounts for all adults and start depositing UBI payments. It becomes, as they put it, an easy mechanism.
Okay, so given this entire perspective, this strong warning from the source, what's their practical advice for parents if these accounts become reality?
They're quite specific. If this policy happens and your child gets one of these on $1,000 accounts, their first suggestion is try to move that $1,000 out immediately into a normal account at a commercial bank you choose.
Get it out of that system.
Right. If, for whatever reason, you can't move it, their advice is just leave the initial $1,000 there. Don't touch it. But the absolute critical piece of advice, the thing they really stress, is do not deposit any of your own money into that account. No extra contributions.
Why not?
Because they see that as willingly converting your own, presumably safer commercial bank money into what they consider a CBDC liability. You'd be putting your funds into a system where they believe the government can easily track it, potentially control it, maybe even use it against you down the line. That's their fear.
Wow. Okay, so let's try to wrap up this deep dive into this particular source material. We've looked at a policy proposal that, on the surface, looks like a straightforward way to give kids a bit of a financial start.
Yeah, seems pretty benign initially, but this source views it totally differently. For them, it's not really about the $1,000. It's about the financial plumbing being laid down underneath. Plumbing, they believe, is really a foundational step towards a much more government-controlled financial system directly linked to the central bank.
And the absolute key takeaway, if someone wants to understand this source's viewpoint.
It really boils down to their core definition and the mechanism they describe. You have to grasp why they argue that a liability of the Federal Reserve equals a CBDC, and then see how they claim these specific accounts fit that definition. That's crucial to understanding their whole perspective and why they're raising the alarm.
It definitely presents a starkly different view of what such a policy could mean. It certainly leaves you thinking, if technology keeps making it easier to track, and maybe even control how money moves, where do you, the listener, draw the line? How do you balance potential convenience or benefits with concerns about privacy and control when thinking about where and how your money is held?